Today we're very happy to have Jacob Conway from Chicago Booth Macroeconomics Group here to talk about consuming values. As always, people on the panel should feel free to unmute and ask questions, and people in the audience, you're more than welcome to type your questions in Q&A. I'll redirect them to Jacob. So
Great.
Jacob, can you share your screen, and the floor is yours?
Yep. So sharing my screen, going to full screen here. So hopefully you can all see my slides. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk with you all about my research, consuming values. So in this research, I'm interested in understanding kind of the causes and consequences of companies engaging with social and political issues. So in particular, this research, and this is joint work with my former Stanford classmate, Levi Boxall. So this research is motivated by a couple of recent trends and facts. Firms and their various stakeholders frequently and increasingly report some kind of social motives in their decision-making. So most large firms state some kind of social goal beyond narrow profit maximization. And if you ask consumers on surveys, a majority of US consumers say that they've made or avoided a purchase because of the social or political values that are associated with firms. And these kinds of preferences are also commonly expressed among employees, investors, other groups. So this has led to active debates about whether these firms' social engagement is consistent with traditional profit maximization motives, or whether it represents some kind of agency problem within the firm where, some managerial decision maker is maximizing their own utility, but maybe it's coming at some cost to shareholders and profits. And it's also led to a debate about whether the social preferences that are expressed by consumers and other stakeholders are really strong enough to matter for the firm's profits and incentives here, or whether this is really just very small preferences or cheap talk that really is only expressed on surveys. So given these trends, there's the potential here for consumers to incentivize or discipline the firm behavior towards the kind of behavior that they want to see. But we don't have a ton of hard evidence on what consumers actually do when it comes time to put their money where their mouth is and on what drives firms' social engagement. So to answer these questions, or to shed light on these debates, I'm going to look at cases in which firms took partisan stances on controversial social issues. So I've put up a montage here of some examples of the kinds of stances I'm thinking about and we'll be talking about throughout this talk. These include stances on the left, like Disney's pushback against legislation they perceived as anti-gay in Florida, as well as Nike's 2018 Colin Kaepernick advertising campaign. Colin Kaepernick is well known for kneeling during the national anthem before NFL games. And this form of protest was generally popular among Democrats at the time and generally unpopular among Republicans. And Nike knows this. They're saying, believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. They know they're wading into a politically controversial issue here. Examples on the right side or on the conservative side include Chick-fil-A's stance by their president and CEO at the time against legalizing gay marriage and in support of the traditional definition of a family, as well as Hobby Lobby's pushback against, in a Supreme Court case, against a mandate to provide contraceptives to their employees under the Obamacare or Affordable Care Act. So we think these kinds of events are interesting because from the perspective of consumers, they represent a sharp exogenous change in the social and political values that are associated with firms. So we can learn from this sharp change, okay, consumers find out, oh, this firm is more liberal or more conservative than I previously thought. And they have an opportunity to respond or not in terms of their consumption choices. So we're going to ask 3 questions around these kinds of stances. First, how do consumers respond to these firm social stances? Second, do firm social stances typically seem to maximize revenues? And third, why do firms seem to take these social stances? So in terms of the empirical strategy or empirical approach for answering these questions, first, we're going to identify in a systematic way the salient and controversial social stances that firms in the US have taken on these partisan social issues. We're then going to turn to analysis of really rich, granular credit and debit card transaction data for 2 purposes. One is to identify which consumers are on their own more liberal or more conservative in terms of their own social views and their social alignment with these firm stances, as well as to identify the consumption responses of these consumers to these firm stances. So the causal effect of these firm stances on revenues overall and from more liberal and more conservative consumer groups. And having identified these consumption responses on the demand side, we can then think about what these demand responses imply for the supply side of what a revenue maximizing firm would want to do and what in practice best seems to predict what firms are doing. So to preview the results that we're going to find, we went into this project seeing people burning their Nike jerseys online and seeing lots of news reports of boycott responses and those sorts of things. And it absolutely is the case that we find that when firms take a stance that you personally disagree with in terms of your own social views, those people go out and buy less from these firms. So there is a negative boycott response among the opposed consumers, but there's also an aligned boycott or positive consumption response among the consumers who agree with the firm's stance. So there's kind of a trade-off here that firms face in catering to the preferences of their different consumers when they want different things. And we find that in general, firms tend to take stances that increase their revenue on average. That's partly because the aligned boycott response is a little bigger than the opposed boycott response, and partly because firms tend to take stances that are pretty well aligned with their existing consumer base. And whether firms take a liberal versus a conservative stance is predicted by who your consumers are and who your employees are. It's not as well predicted by who your board of directors or CEO donates to politically. So those are the strongest predictors of the stance. So that's where we're going. In this research, we're contributing to a few different literatures here, most directly on socially conscious consumerism. So here a lot of this research relies either on unincentivized survey data or some of the best recent papers, especially in marketing, quantitative marketing, look at kind of one-off events. And this is where a lot of the best work is being done. But with any time you're looking at one-off events, like say Goya's stance in well-known Spilling the Beans paper, you might worry that there are other potential confounds at the same time. So it's helpful to look at actual systematic credit and debit card transactions across a wider variety of social stance events. We're also contributing to a literature here on corporate branding and advertising effects. I mean, one way to think about what firms are doing here is they're changing this corporate branding. They're changing the social and political values that are associated with this firm overall. And so about here, we're analyzing these sharp and salient changes to these values that are associated with firms and identifying causal effects on consumption choices. We're also contributing to a literature here on the other impacts and drivers of firm environmental, social, governance choices. So we're analyzing here, particularly consumers and to some extent other stakeholders as responding to and potentially driving firm stances. So I'll pause here just a little bit for questions in case there are any questions that have come up. And if not, I'll jump into the conceptual framework of how I'm thinking about the firm's problem.
Yeah, Jacob, I have a quick question regarding the second point that you made. So are you trying to kind of quantify the causal impact of the firm's action of taking a stance action, or consumers' expectation of firms taking a stance? Or to put it differently, like, is it relative to the alternative case where a firm does not take a social stance on something controversial, which they could have? Is that?
Yeah. So I'm going to try and identify the causal effect of the firm having taken this observed stance versus a counterfactual of the consumption that would have occurred had the firm not taken an explicit social stance at this time.
Okay.
So I'll be a little more precise about exactly how I'm going to do that, but that's the kind of, when I talk about causal effects, that's what I mean here.
Okay, gotcha. And you're assuming that the belief between of the use of the consumers before and after the event happens actually remains the same, right? The consumers' valuation or their stance on
their own ideologies. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. So I'm going to treat consumer preferences as fixed. I'm going to be able to read off in some survey data I'm working with that consumers' preferences of a given firm are indeed changing. So prior to these firm social stance events, consumers generally viewed these firms that took stances as kind of towards the middle of the ideology distribution, and that they had equally favorable opinions towards them among Democrats versus Republicans. And then that's going to polarize after they take the stance.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks so much. Yeah.
So the firm's conceptual framework, as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about a firm that wants to maximize the net. Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting. Can I ask you a clarification question about the research question? So you said you wanted to analyze the revenue maximizing behavior. So are you going to have like an objective function where the firm maximize over the profit? Or are you going to use the model to quantify the money that the company left on the table by not aligning with so how do I understand this? So
it's a great question. So let me dive into an appendix slide here that will help answer it. So what I have in mind ultimately is the firm's objective function is they want to take a stance that maximizes the net present value of their profits going forward, not revenues. And they might, so that includes the revenue, the margin or markup they make on any given unit of sales, less the direct cost of taking a stance. And they might want to align with the preferences of their stakeholders for non-pecuniary reasons. So that's ultimately what I have in mind is, kind of the underlying firm objective function. And I'm thinking of a firm having an opportunity to take a stance on a binary social issue. So they can either take a stance for a given position on an issue, against that side of the issue, or they can choose not to take an explicit stance. Now, throughout most of the talk, I'm going to shut down these kinds of non-pecuniary motives and just think as a benchmark about what a profit maximizing firm would want to do. And then at the end, we can bring in some of these other stakeholder preferences to see to what extent they explain what firms do in practice. And then, as I was just mentioning on the previous slide, I started off with, okay, what would a revenue maximizing firm want to do? Ultimately, I'd be interested in what would a profit maximizing firm want to do. But what I'm going to be able to see in the transaction data I'm working with is revenues, not profits. So let's talk about two ways in which those differ. One is that I'm not going to see the direct cost of taking a stance itself. So to the extent that taking a stance is costly, you're putting some advertising dollars or something like that behind it, I'm not going to capture that cost by just looking at revenues. I think to the first order, the vast majority of these stances are not directly costly per se. I think it's right to first order to kind of treat this direct cost as negligible. And I have some data on advertising that kind of suggests they're not significantly increasing their advertising spending for the most part, those sorts of things. It's mostly things like Chick-fil-A's president and COO making a statement pretty cautiously of his political views on a conservative radio show, with some exceptions, like obviously Nike's ad was an advertising campaign. But I think it's right to first order to, given the revenue responses we're going to see, to not think about the direct cost of taking these stances and to treat those as zero. The other way in which profits differ from revenues is for every dollar of revenues, firms only make some percentage of that, some margin or markup of that as profits. So by looking at revenues instead of profits, I'm essentially going to be treating, in this maximization problem, the markup as positive and constant as a function of taking your stance. I think there are reasons to think that, maybe your markup goes up or down. You have more market power as a result of taking your stance, either because you've now maybe differentiated the market. So now you're the blue shoe company that doesn't have to compete against the red shoe company. So maybe that increases your markup and margin. Or maybe, as I mentioned, firms tend to take stances that align pretty well with their existing consumer base. So maybe that increases for employees' willingness to work for you and maybe their productivity on the job in ways that are going to affect the marginal cost side of the production function that won't be captured by just looking at revenues. I'm essentially going to be treating those as constant by looking at revenues. So that's in particular, I have in mind ultimately a profit maximizing firm, but I'm ultimately going to be looking at a revenue maximizing firm today. I have in mind that the revenues that a firm receives in dollars overall is made up of consumption from different groups of consumers, G, in society. So these are potentially arbitrary. An example would be some consumers agree with the for side of the issue, some consumers agree with the against side of that binary social issue. And in principle, the consumption from each of these different groups could respond differently in non-parametric ways to the firm's social stance itself. So I'm also going to assume that consumers are aware of a firm stance with some IID probability tau that potentially varies across groups. That's going to potentially vary across events, and otherwise they're going to assume that the firm hasn't taken an explicit social stance. Now, in survey data from this time period, I can directly measure what share of consumers do I think had heard about this firm's social stance, and I can do that separately from consumers who are going to end up being aligned with or opposed to the firm stance. And I find similar measures of consumer awareness among the aligned and opposed and kind of more middle of the ideology groups. So based on that data, I'm going to treat this consumer awareness as varying across events, but not varying across these different groups. And that allows me to think of this consumer awareness tau as a treatment intensity that varies across events. So an event is bigger if more people hear about it and have a chance to respond in their consumption. And an event is smaller if fewer people hear about it.
Hey, Jacob.
So, yeah.
Going back to the conceptual framework, thought it was interesting how you're bringing up NPV maximization here, because it kind of implies that it'll depend on the discount rate that the firm has at the time. Have you thought about how that might, you have a pretty good panel here and some shocks to what discount rates might be. Have you thought about messing around with their incentives to make a stance based on, cash flows far out in the future versus the shock that might happen today?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. When I take the data, what I'm going to find in terms of the consumption impact is I'm going to find it's going to have a longer lasting impact on the composition of your consumer base going forward. But in terms of your overall revenue, you're essentially going to get to pocket in the month you take the firm stance and increase in your revenues. And after that, I don't detect significant effects. So given that the impact on overall revenues is kind of just temporary in terms of the point in time estimates, I don't think there's a ton of scope for the NPV to matter here, but I think it'd be something that would be interesting to think about in the future. But it's a great question. So the firm problem, as I've written it down here, is equivalent of maximizing revenues is also equivalent to maximizing the percent change in your revenues from taking a stance versus not taking a stance, which is this term on the left down here. And that overall revenue impact from taking the stance is in turn a weighted average of the consumption responses of each of these different groups of consumers. So in particular, the weights here in this weighted average are these baseline shares of what share of your consumption in dollars comes from each of these different groups. So if 90% of your consumers in dollars prior to your stance are liberal consumers, how the liberal consumers respond is going to be super important for determining the overall revenue impact, and how the conservative consumers respond is going to be less important, and vice versa if your baseline shares skew more conservative. In addition to this baseline shares, these weights, we're taking the average of these group-specific consumption responses, which we can split up into two terms. The awareness, so what share of consumers heard about the firm's social stance, as well as the consumption response conditional on awareness. So for every consumer who hears about your firm stance, what is the consumption response in log dollars from this group overall at this firm relative to not taking a social stance? So these are kind of the three empirical targets on the right that we want to estimate throughout the rest of this talk as kind of the things that matter for the firm's problem, as I've written it down in this conceptual framework. So the data I'm going to use to identify these different parameters, these different empirical targets, is primarily really rich credit and debit card data. Yeah.
Sorry, Jacob.
Can I interrupt you on the conceptual framework? So it seems that you're not going to microfound the why there's a impact on revenue. So should I think about consideration? Should I think about kind of a Becker-Murphy style consumption complements? Are you going to take a stance on that?
So I'm not going to take a stance on that. I'm going to estimate these consumption responses and revenues in non-parametric ways, but I'm not going to have an answer for you as to why consumers are responding. I think there would be scope to learn about kind of the mechanisms behind this response, in the sense that we can look across different events where the prevalence of different mechanisms might be varying. So, or the importance of different. So if, for example, social image concerns were a primary driver of these consumption responses, we might expect to see bigger responses for a company like Nike, because everyone sees the Nike swoosh that's on your clothes, and a smaller consumption response for something like Home Depot, where no one sees the Home Depot products you have in your basement or something like that. So I think there's scope to learn about this by analyzing heterogeneity across the events. I won't have that today. And from the firm side, it doesn't really matter if all you care about is maximizing revenues. So you don't exactly care about why consumers are responding. But I think for learning about consumer behavior, I would absolutely love to unpack that more in the future. I think there was another question. Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up question on this. Is this consumer response only intensive margin, not the extensive, in the sense that you don't care about the new customers actually start buying, or or this is both?
So this is capturing both and pushing them together. So I'm going to look at log consumption in dollars from all the consumers of this group. So to the extent that in aggregate, so to the extent that that's changing, that's going to include both people moving into or out of buying from this firm within that group, as well as people within that firm who are already buying more or less. I think in the transaction data, I could absolutely split apart the intensive versus extensive margin responses. I'm not going to do that today, but I think it'd be interesting to look at. We could do lots of other things in the transaction data too, like look at people who were historically Adidas customers. How did they respond to Nike's stance versus people who are historically Nike customers, vice versa, versus people who are multi-homing. I think those would all be cool to look at. I won't have those today, but I think it's a nice direction.
Can consumers change groups?
No. So the way I'm identifying people's ideologies, which I'll talk about more in a few slides, I'm going to treat these as fixed within an individual, which seems roughly right in the data. So let me defer that question of how I'm measuring people's ideologies until a little bit, but I'll be more clear about how exactly I'm measuring ideologies. I'm going to learn about it from the transaction data and people's demographics. So the data I'm using to analyze this, to identify these empirical targets, is credit and debit card data from a large payment card company. So this covers 2008 to the present. I'm using this data processes transactions on their network all over the world. I'm only going to use their US transactions. The data is at the transaction level, and it's longitudinal, meaning that I can track the different transactions that a given card makes at different points in time, which is going to be super useful for me for people identifying people's social views and ideologies. The data is depersonalized, so I don't see people's names. I just have a hashed card identifier, and I can see the different transactions they made by that card over time. It's a really big data set. It's 20% of all consumption that occurs in the US. So that includes in the denominator cash, credit and debit cards, checks, everything. It's about 20% of that. And I think it's very representative of credit and debit card consumers in the US. An observation in my data set is a transaction. So if you look at your credit card statement, it essentially looks like one of the transactions you might see on that. So I see the precise purchase date that it occurred at. I see the merchant it occurred at. So I would see, for example, Andre's card just spent $7 at this particular Starbucks location. I don't see precisely the items that were purchased or the prices paid, but I see the total dollar amount and exactly when it occurred. So one limitation of that is that I'm going to miss kind of resale of, say, Nike. I'm going to capture sales of Nike at Nike stores and Nike.com. I'm going to miss resale of Nike through something like Amazon or Foot Locker. The results look very similar if I subset to the set of events in my data that don't have a significant resale component. And I'm working on bringing in some numerator data that would tell me more about these kind of resale component as well. But I don't think it's a big issue for my current results, but I'm bringing on some more data to speak more to it. Also, for most credit cards in recent years, I can link this transaction data to individual level demographic data. And I'm going to use all this data to impute individuals' social ideology, social alignment and ideologies, and to quantify their consumption responses. So this is the main data set I'm going to be using. I'm going to complement this with a few other data sets. I think the most notable is and helpful is YouGov's brand index data set. So YouGov's brand index data set, as some of you may be familiar with, is these are brand perception surveys that YouGov, fortunately for me, has been running from 2007 to the present. So they ask at least 5,000 respondents in the US each day from their panel of more than 4 million plus US respondents about their perceptions of different firms in the economy. And that's going to allow me to learn about people's prior beliefs about these firms, to what extent are they learning about the firm's stances, and how are they responding in terms of their favorability and purchase intent, those sorts of things, as a complement to the transaction data. I'm also going to complement this with a few other data sets that I'm primarily going to use to identify events and measure their salience, and I'll talk about more about those in a few slides. So to give an outline for the rest of the talk, I'll talk about first how I identify, we want to estimate these 3 empirical targets. I'll talk about first how I select events and measure consumer awareness of each event. Then I'll talk about how I can identify individual consumers' ideologies or social views, as well as to measure the baseline shares that firms are getting from each of these different groups in society. Then I'll talk about how we can identify individuals' consumption responses, causal effect on consumption, and then think about their supply side implications. So I'll pause here for questions before diving into event selection and consumer awareness.
Yeah, maybe Jacob, quickly, and maybe this is for a broader discussion, but I was wondering how you think about this. Is there any relationship between firms in different industries taking a stance towards one cause or towards another one? In a way I'm thinking about this is if too many firms are taking, let's say, a Republican stance on some issues, do they compete with each other now in some way? Like, I'm willing to pay a bit more money for beans which support Trump, but if it's also cucumbers and other stuff, at some point I don't care. Like, or they complement, like how? Like,
yeah. What are the competitive interactions here? Is that kind of what you're thinking about?
And is there anything you can say about this with the data? I don't know how much overlap in the brands you're looking at. Will there be any overlap within, like, the same person is exposed to multiple things in this overlap, like markets overlap by them? But I'm curious if you see some of this.
Yeah, I think that's a super interesting question. The way I'm going to select events. So let me tell you a little about how I select events, and then we can talk about. So I don't think there's a ton of scope to measure competitive interactions based on the way I'm selecting events. And so let me tell you exactly how I'm going to do that, and then we can talk a little bit more. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to look for events that occur between 2011 and 2022 Q1. And my primary method of selecting events is going to be keyword based. So I'm going to look for firm names showing up together with keywords indicative of social stances in either the same Google Trends search or in the same news article, in the text of the news article. And when there's an unusual spike in that co-occurrence, that identifies a potential social stance event around that time. So because I'm looking for specific firm names, this ultimately ends up mostly selecting kind of one-off events by firms. It's mostly not things like the January 6th Capitol riot happens, or there's the murder of George Floyd, and a bunch of firms in the industry are all kind of responding at the same time. When there's this kind of salient stance as I'm going to measure it, it's really typically one firm interacting in an isolated way at a time. And typically other firms either are not reacting in salient ways to consumers, at least as I'm going to pick up in this event study, in this event selection and salience measurement. So I think there would be a lot of scope to analyze competitive interactions and how different firms kind of position themselves maybe in like some kind of hoteling model in response to the same event that happens in society, like the January 6th Capitol riots or the murder of George Floyd. But that's mostly not what I'm going to be studying here. You should think of what I'm studying here as one firm chooses to move itself from typically viewed towards the more middle of the ideology distribution to one or the other extreme, and the other firms that are responding are not or the other firms that they compete with are not responding in salient ways to consumers, and that I'm generally not going to select other events around the same time by competitors. And if I ever do, they're very not salient to consumers, and that there's very little consumer awareness of these competitive responses. Does that answer your question, Andre?
I think the key question is how much people will still have salience going forward of political positions. So we can talk more afterward as well about this, but I feel like if I now know, like, feel like a bunch of brands have, let's say, left-wing ideological position, will I react more or less once another firm is taking a stance? And it depends, like, and I don't know if we can measure, like, people is it salient to them in the long run?
I don't think I have great data that would speak to if you already view one of your competitors. I don't think I have enough events here to really think about the answer to that question. What I can tell you is if a firm takes, say, a liberal stance, they are they do typically, they try and take a second stance in the future sometimes, but when they do, that's not nearly as salient to consumers. There's very little consumer awareness. There's very little news coverage. So to the first order, think of it as like firms kind of have a one-off opportunity to choose to move themselves to one or the other extreme. Once they've done that, anything else they do is not that salient to consumers to kind of double down on that stance.
Got it. Thanks.
There was another question.
Oh, you already answered my question. Yeah, so I had some similar questions.
Okay, perfect.
Just building on Andre's point,
yeah,
Jacob, you might see some type of like a herd mentality in terms of like, you might not see salience for the second and third movers in a stance, but they're watching that first firm. So if you have heterogeneity in where some stances get, positive revenue shocks, other ones might have more negative ones. And you could see, like, are there more adopters following along?
Following a positive shock. I think that's a cool idea. Shock. I'm going to find a majority positive revenue impacts. Something like 78% of the events I look at, I estimate to have positive revenue impacts. But I do think that would be some interesting heterogeneity to look at. So I was potentially worried in my event selection methodology that maybe I'm missing I didn't know to ask about some keywords or topics. So I'm going to complement these two methods with two additional methods. One is I'm going to look in these brand perception surveys from YouGov Brand Index for cases in which favorability polarized towards a firm among Democrats versus Republicans. I'm also just going to ask ChatGPT to give me a list of the most salient partisan social stances the firms in the US have taken during this time period. These latter two methods do a pretty good job of returning the major events that were selected by the keyword-based methods, but they don't add very much that's new. So you should, to first order, it's kind of right to think of this as basically being the keyword-based event selection method. But it was comforting to me that it wasn't adding a lot more events that I was missing in terms of the topics I was searching for. So I'm going to take the union of events that were suggested by these different methods. I'm going to filter to events where I'm able to confirm that there was a social stance taken by the firm at this time period. So this is going to drop, for example, a firm name spiking with the words gun control because there was a shooting at one of its stores and not because it took a social stance. It would also drop anything that say ChatGPT hallucinated. ChatGPT does a very good job and would have saved me a lot of time if I'd used it earlier. So that gives me 117 social stance events to analyze throughout the rest of the talk. So having identified events, we next want to measure what share of consumers had heard about the firm stance at the time period of the event. It wouldn't be sufficient to just ask them now because these events occurred at different points in time. Maybe people have forgotten to some extent or something like that. But fortunately for me, I can use these YouGov brand index questions that were being asked about around the same time. So in particular, there's a question in these brand index surveys that ask respondents, have you heard anything good or bad about this firm in the last 2 weeks? So by looking at the share of consumers who said they heard something good or bad about this firm in the last 2 weeks, in the month following the firm's social stance versus the month right before the firm's social stance, I can form some estimate of what share of consumers do I think had heard about the firm's social stance itself. And if I look in the plot here on the bottom left, on the x-axis, I'm putting months relative to the firm's event. So month 0 starts with the day of the firm's social stance event and is the following 28 days. On the y-axis, I'm plotting what share of consumers are on average across these 117 events are reporting hearing unusual news about the firm, kind of above the normal levels in the month right before the firm's social stance. So I'm estimating that on average, about 5% of consumers hear about these firm's social stances. That varies a lot across events. For some of the largest events, that's as high as 40% in the histogram I'm showing here down in the bottom right. And that's smaller for many other events. So it highlights the importance of treating of thinking of measuring this consumer awareness and thinking of it as a treatment intensity. So we'd expect to see larger consumption responses when more people hear about an event. So we want to scale these consumption responses relative to this treatment intensity when we're looking across different events that vary in their magnitude. This is also the same survey data that we're learning a lot of other things from. For example, that Democrats and Republicans are equally likely to hear about the event, that most people hear about these firms' social stances, not from the firm itself, not through advertising by the firm or something like that, but mostly through word of mouth exposure and news exposure. And this is also the data that we're learning about people's priors. People had similarly favorable opinions towards the firm, regardless of whether you were Democrat or Republican prior to their social stance, and then that polarizes afterwards. We're also kind of confirming that Democrats are interpreting liberal stances as good news and conservative stances as bad news, and vice versa, in that Democrats are more likely to say they heard something good about the firm when the firm took a liberal stance, more likely to say they heard something bad about the firm when a firm took a conservative stance, and vice versa for conservatives.
Jacob,
so yeah, you
should I be worried that Tau might be capturing changes in consideration sets in general, and that kind of relates to what happens in the outcome revenue?
So the way I'm thinking about Tau is more people hear about the firm stance, and I want to know, if you hear about the firm stance, how do you respond in your consumption? I think, so one thing I can do is I can plot on the x-axis across events what share of people heard about the firm stance, and on the y-axis, how big was the consumption response we're going to see. And if I do that across different events, I find a pretty linear relationship. So you might have been concerned that maybe the bigger events, more people hear about them, but they also care more about them conditional on hearing about them. That's not consistent with what I'm finding in that relationship I just described. Does that answer your question, or do you have something else?
I think what I'm thinking is more like in your conceptual model, because you're capturing Tau as hearing about the event, not hearing about the firm. Are we making an assumption that, you know, either there's full consideration set, everybody knows about the firm's existence, or there's limited consideration set, but that's orthogonal to Tau?
Yeah, so what I can say, these are, because of what I can track consistently over time in the data, these are mostly large national firms. If I measure you can also ask in these brand preference surveys, just have you heard about this firm? Are you aware that they exist? And those numbers are close to 100 across these different events, across these different firms. Most people have heard about these firms. These firms may be becoming more salient to people, and that could be part of the driver of this consumption response. They're just top of mind or something like that. That I can't rule out, but I don't think people are learning that the firm exists through these stances.
Okay, thanks.
So having
Jacob,
yes.
Sorry for
no.
I'm wondering if you can give some information about what these social events are. So my question is related with, if there is a car company and consumers are not purchasing them very frequently, even if it takes a stance, we won't observe it in the sales data, right?
So I can tell you, I can't tell you precisely which merchants are included in my data. I do give kind of generic descriptions of the events, as well as this measure of Tau, of like what kind of thing, and whether it was a direction kind of for stances like Nike's in the liberal direction or against in a conservative direction. I can't tell you precisely which merchant it occurred for. Something like a car purchase would typically not show up on a credit card, and that typically wouldn't be analyzed in my transaction data. Something like, regular subscription revenue or something like that, I agree, it's kind of chunky within any individual consumer. But if you aggregate across a large number of consumers, it kind of smooths out the consumption response. What's typical. So feel free to follow up if you have more questions on that. And otherwise, so we've now identified a set of events, and we measured consumer awareness of each event. We next want to talk about how can we identify individual consumers' social views, and these baseline shares, what share of consumption for a firm comes from more liberal versus more conservative consumers in society in the absence of their social stance. So to identify individual consumers' social views, so to answer your question from quite a few slides ago, this is non-trivial because I don't have people's names. I can't just look up their party affiliation, but you can learn a lot about people from looking at their transactions. And in particular, for some cards in the data, I can see individual transactions that tell me clearly this person is likely liberal or this person is likely conservative. These are donations to political action committees, PACs, other political donations. to social and charitable organizations that have clear social political goals. So we can take all the cards in the data and just use the political donors. So we have liberal political donors, conservative political donors. If we just cared about do consumers ever respond, we could just compare the consumption response of those two groups and see if they differ. But most cards in the economy, most dollars in the economy are not political donors. So we want to know how those groups are responding to, and what we want to infer ideology among those groups. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to take the political donors and use them to train a machine learning model, where we're going to predict if you were a donor, would you be more likely to be a liberal donor and for stances like Nike's, or a conservative donor and against stances like Nike's, based on all your other transactions and demographics. So the method I'm going to use is XGBoost, or extreme gradient boosting, which is a common machine learning method for this kind of classification problem. I'm going to train the model on 70% of the political donors and hold out 30% of the political donors to use as an out-of-sample validation data set. The predictors I'm going to use are transactions that other merchants in the data that didn't take stances, but that on their own are predictive of being a Democratic donor or conservative donor in a chi-squared sense. So the values a lot of dollars being spent at these firms. They're not just tiny companies, but they have a skewed distribution of Democrats versus Republicans consuming from them. As well as I'm also going to use the demographics of your inferred home county based on where you do your in-person transactions, as well as your own individual demographic data when it's available from your credit report. So these machine learning methods can be kind of black boxy. So let me give you some examples of the most important features that's picking up on. It's ultimately using over 1,000 predictors in these machine learning predictions. But let's talk about the most important ones in terms of how much they increase our predictive accuracy. Well, the single most important predictor, I think unsurprisingly, that predicts that you're likely to be conservative and against stances like Nike's, and therefore in favor of stances like Chick-fil-A's, is the Republican vote share in your home county. But almost just as important to know is whether you have, say, a New York Times subscription versus a Wall Street Journal subscription. So you're more likely to be a liberal political donor if you live in a county with a high Democratic vote share, if you have a New York Times subscription, if you have transactions that indicate you go into cities a lot, like parking meters and garages, if you shop at bookstores, if you donate to companies like Planned Parenthood, organizations like Planned Parenthood that aren't explicitly political but are strongly correlated with politics, those sorts of things. You're more likely to be a conservative political donor if you make religious donations, if you donate to things like the National Rifle Association, if you shop at fast food restaurants or go to golf courses. So there's lots of correlations in the transaction data that are helpful for making these predictions. So first, we want to ask, can we do a good job of making these predictions among the political donors? So to answer that, on the x-axis, and looking at the out-of-sample, the 30% of political donors that we didn't use to train the model. And on the x-axis, I'm plotting the probability of being predicted to be a conservative political donor and against stances like Nike's. And I'm doing that separately for people who are actually conservative political donors in red and people who are actually liberal political donors in black. And we plot the densities of our ideology predictions, and we see, we're doing a pretty good job of separating these two groups. There's some overlap where it's not a perfect discriminant, but we're making pretty different predictions for these two groups. In terms of the out-of-sample performance of our predictions, if we drew a random Democrat or random Republican, what's the probability that we predicted their accuracy correct, their party correctly? It's 81%, equally weighting Democrats and Republicans. The area under the curve here is 0.89. So said differently, if we drew a random Democrat and a random Republican, the probability that we sorted them correctly in their ideology is 89%. So these aren't perfect predictions, but I think pretty good by kind of traditional metrics. So we're going to take the model that we've trained on the political donors and use it to make ideology predictions among non-donors. And we're going to take all the cards in the data and split them up into 12 different groups. We have the liberal political donors and the conservative political donors that we're going to keep separate. And then we're going to take all the non-donors and split them up into deciles of predicted ideology from predicted to be most liberal to predicted to be most conservative. So that's 12 different groups that we've partitioned the cards into that we want to look at consumption responses among each of those different groups separately. We can also look at, in the year prior to the firm's social stance, what share of consumption in dollars comes from each of these 12 different consumer groups. So that's what I'm plotting here in these bars on the left. A bar that's taller means that more consumption in dollars is coming from that group at the firm prior to the social stance event. On average, a little more of the consumption for these firms that took stances is coming from the aligned political donors. So if you took a liberal stance, from the aligned consumers, so if you took a liberal stance, these are the more liberal consumers. If you took a conservative stance, these are the more conservative consumers, and a little less of the consumption than 50% is coming in dollars from these more opposed consumer groups. So these are the baseline shares that we wanted to estimate, or at least a proxy for them. So having identified a set of events, measured consumer awareness, and identified people's ideologies and measured these baseline shares, we next want to identify what is the causal effect of these firm stances on consumption from each of these different consumer groups. So I'll flag that given the pieces we've already identified, we can already directly read off this from the data, this term on the left in this ratio, which is the log consumption in dollars from a given consumer group at the firm, given its actual social stance. What we don't see directly from the data is what's the consumption that would have happened had the firm not taken an explicit social stance at this time. So to identify causal effects, we essentially need to impute that no stance counterfactual of what would have happened if the firm hadn't taken a social stance. So we're going to do that in two ways. First, just very simply, let's assume that kind of group time trends that are not firm specific. So if consumption among liberal political donors grew by, say, 3% at all other firms in the economy in a given month, it also would have grown by 3% at our event study firm in that same time period. So and compared to that counterfactual. So now we're plotting here on the x-axis months relative to the firm's event. On the y-axis, the log consumption response we'd expect to see for every 25% of consumers who hear about the firm's stance. And we're doing that separately for 12 different consumer groups, colored from more aligned in purple to more opposed in brown. So there's some non-political shocks that are moving all these firms up or down that we'll want to do a better job of cleaning out in future in a couple slides. But let's see what happens to these different consumer groups when firms take a stance. We see kind of sharply diverging consumption responses among that the more aligned consumers are increasing their consumption by quite a bit. The more opposed consumers are decreasing their consumption by quite a bit. And we see this sorting of consumption responses all throughout the ideology distribution, and that all 10 deciles of non-donors also sorted themselves in their consumption response, exactly as we would predict if people had a desire to align their consumption with the social and political values of firms. So to put some magnitudes on this, we see that for every 25% of consumers who hear about the firm's stance, the aligned political donors increase their consumption by 18% in the month of the firm's stance. The opposed political donors decrease their consumption by 12%. And these have pretty persistent impacts in subsequent months. So, but we also want to do a better job of cleaning up these kind of non-political shocks that are moving all these groups up or down. So how can we do that? We want to better form this counterfactual of what would have happened had the firm not taken a stance. To do that, we're going to use synthetic difference in differences. So we're going to try and form for, let's say, Nike took a stance or Chick-fil-A took a stance. We're going to try and form a synthetic Nike or a synthetic Chick-fil-A such that the synthetic Nike or synthetic Chick-fil-A closely tracks consumption at Nike or at Chick-fil-A in the 2 years or 104 weeks of weekly consumption prior to the firm's social stance. And then we're going to use that to make a 1-year out of sample forecast. The control units we're going to use are other firms in the data that didn't take social stances, as well as potentially your own past self, lagged 1 year to get at kind of firm specific seasonality. So ultimately what we want to do is we want to train the weights of this synthetic difference in differences model using the 104 weeks of data or 2 years prior to the firm's social stance event, and then make a 1-year out of sample forecast for the 52 weeks following the firm's social stance. How can we tell what's the right way to do this? What's the best way to do this? And are we doing a good job? Well, we can look in past data at 3-year periods where we can train the data on 2 years of data and then use it to make a 1-year out of sample forecast during a time period where the firm actually hasn't taken a social stance. So the no stance counterfactual that we're trying to estimate is exactly what we observe in the data. So we can use that to get a sense of what's the best method for making these predictions for any given firm. Are we able to do a good job of predicting consumption at this firm to get an estimate of the precision of our forecasts? And then we can compare the consumption that actually happened for the firm overall to this synthetic counterfactual scaled relative to the consumer awareness and take a precision weighted average across these different events.
Jacob, just a quick question about this synthetic, the idea here. Can you just help me understand a little bit more how this method could address this potential selection issue that, you know, the firms that don't take a stance is exactly because they expect that there's low demand, you know, or feared some kind of backlashes from the consumers. So yeah, how could them be about?
So I think in general, what I want to think is that in general, what I think is true is that if firms hadn't taken these stances in the majority of cases, it would have otherwise just been kind of business as normal. because like Nike, there was nothing particularly otherwise salient for Nike happening at this time period. Colin Kaepernick had been kneeling for months before this event. He was not an explicit Nike endorser prior to this event. And then they chose to do something unusual. So the counterfactual for what would have happened for these firms had they not taken a stance is pretty well approximated by whatever prediction we'd make from other firms that didn't take stances. And we show that we can do a pretty good job of making that prediction during previous times when the firms didn't take a stance. And now we're trying to make a 1 year out of sample forecast following when firms did take a stance.
Okay, so I get the fact that you include this past 1 year of the firm itself does that kind of address this issue?
That's just trying to get at kind of firm specific seasonality. So if there's a time period of consumption within this firm, typically before their event, that's otherwise hard to match with other firms, this control unit could be used to kind of fit that pattern if the data thinks that's important in these past predictions.
Yeah, I understand that, but still, among the firms that don't take a stance. So basically the assumption here is that among the control versus the treated group, right? The control, they would have taken a stance just for some reason that is not demand driven, right?
No, so I'm assuming I want to take a weighted average, essentially, of these different firms that didn't take a stance.
Right.
And when I do that with the weights in this 2 years of prior to the firm stance, I can show that does a pretty good job of matching the consumption that we actually see for these event study firms prior to when they took a stance. What I need is that it's still a good predictor in the year following the firm stance of what would have happened if the firm hadn't taken a stance.
Okay, yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'll maybe follow up later, but
okay,
yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah, thanks.
So when we do that, when we compare the actual consumption that happened relative to synthetic counterfactual relative to consumer awareness, we estimate that in the month of the firm's social stance, there's a 3.4% increase in consumption overall, in revenues overall at these firms that took stances for every 25% consumer awareness. That's kind of a 1 month benefit for the firm. They get to pocket that 3.4% increase in revenues. And then afterwards, there's no significant point in time estimate of consumption on subsequent months. So I think I'm not sure if this is what you were asking about, Jesse. You might be worried about spillovers to other firms or something like that. When Nike takes a stance, maybe that impacts Adidas, and maybe we don't want to use Adidas as a control unit as a result. If I exclude the closest competitors of a firm as potential control units, it looks like almost identical.
Oh, okay. I feel like that
mostly because they don't end up being picked as control units in the first place.
Gotcha. Yeah, I feel like that might be the kind of the peer pressure from a competitor might be even a good IB. But if you show that excluding them is looks the same, like the results, then I think it's a good,
okay. So that's our estimate of the consumption impact overall. We can then shift the group-specific consumption responses we saw up or down such that they aggregate up to that overall revenue estimate that we saw before. So that's what we do here. And these are our preferred estimates of the causal effect of consumption of the firm stance on consumption from each of these different groups. So we estimate that the aligned political donors increase their consumption by 19% in the month of the firm stance. The opposed political donors decrease their consumption by 11%, and all the non-donors respond from something like 10% increase among the most aligned non-donor decile to minus 5% or so among the most opposed non-donor decile. While the previous plot showed much smaller magnitude overall impacts because there's some offsetting results among these different groups and not as persistent, we actually see that the impacts on the composition of your consumer base going forward are somewhat more persistent. So I think Andre had previously asked the question of kind of how long do people remember this or how long does this last? Well, one thing we can do is we can look over kind of longer time horizons at these consumption responses. Here, we can no longer use our synthetic difference in differences counterfactual because using 1 year lag data would no longer, that's now affected by the transaction data, by the stance over longer time periods, but we can normalize the middle groups to 0, the kind of 5th and 6th deciles to 0. And we can see that the non-donors come back together in their consumption response after about 1 year, except for maybe the most extreme decile of non-donors, which come back together after about 2 years. The political donors themselves kind of stay apart and plateau at a gap of, something like 15% differences in consumption. And that's kind of persistent and plateaus kind of as far out as I've ever looked at it. So that's kind of how long people seem to remember and respond to this in their consumption behavior. The impacts on favorability are also quite long across various groups. But it stops kind of showing up in consumption for most people on average across these events after about a year. So another thing we can do is we can look at on the consumption response in the month the firm stands, so the y-axis from this plot, versus the x-axis is what share of consumption or what share of consumers in that group do we estimate we're aligned with versus opposed to the firm stance, to see how this consumption response is changing with what share of consumers are aligned with the firm stance using the ideology of our the point estimates of our ideology predictions. And here we see that the political donors, which is the dot that we assumed here is 100% aligned or 0% aligned for the opposed political donors, they seem to be responding more extremely in their consumption than you'd predict, even given the fact that more of their consumers are aligned with the firm stance. So which makes sense because these are already people who have shown some willingness to pay with their consumption, with their money for their social and political views, and they do that more so in these consumption responses as well. If we draw kind of a best fit line through these group specific consumption responses, we can look at the slope of that line in the plot here on the right. So we see a slope of about 0.2 here in the month of the firm's social stance, along with a 95% confidence interval. That kind of gradually declines over the next year or so as these groups kind of start to come back together in their consumption response. So we can also look separately at cases where firms took a liberal stance on the left and cases where firms took a conservative stance on the right. We find the same kind of diverging consumption responses in both cases, but they seem, if anything, stronger for the same level of consumer awareness when firms took a conservative stance. And these seem to drive a lot of our positive consumption response impacts. So those are kind of the demand side responses. Before we turn to kind of the supply side implications, let me pause for questions.
We also only have 9 minutes, so maybe let's just finish the talk
Sure.
and then we'll have a few more minutes.
Sounds good. So as one thing that matters in this plot is, some consumers are responding positively, some are responding negatively to the same stance. So how these aggregate up really is going to depend on, are most of your consumers coming from the more aligned groups or are most of your consumers coming from the more opposed groups? And those can vary a lot in society. So if we look at consumption in general in the state of, from consumers in the state of Massachusetts, there's a lot more consumption in dollars coming from the gray, more liberal consumers. And if we look at consumption in the state of Alabama, there's a lot more consumption coming from the red conservative consumers who are likely against stances like Nike's. There's also a lot of variation by industry. For example, if you were a company in the arts, entertainment, and recreation industry, on average, you have a lot more liberal consumers. And if you're in the agricultural, forestry, fishing, and hunting industry, you have a lot more of the conservative consumers. So we can think about, one way of visualizing how these baseline shares matter is we could think about the same stance. Say, imagine you took a liberal stance, but we aggregate up those group-specific consumption responses as if your baseline shares look like the economy of different states. So when we do that, we find that, after 5 months, if you took a liberal stance, on average, you'd come out quite far ahead in terms of your consumption impact if your baseline shares look like the state of California. But these can definitely turn negative if you took the same stance in, say, the state of Alabama. Just because even though the aligned consumers are responding somewhat more positively on average, you just have a lot more of the opposed consumers, and they're going to overwhelm the positive consumption response. So one other thing we can do is we can think about whose preferences best predict what firms do in practice. So we can try and predict, conditional on taking a stance, are you going to take a liberal stance for the direction of Nike's or a conservative stance against the direction of Nike's? And can we predict that based on what share of your consumers are liberal and for stances like Nike's, what share of your employees based on their or CEO or board of directors donations based on FEC political donation data go to liberal versus conservative causes? And what about whether you're a publicly traded or privately owned firm, to see whose preferences best predict whether you take a liberal versus conservative stance? So we find you're more likely to take a liberal stance for the direction of Nike's if you're a publicly traded rather than privately owned firm, if your consumers are more liberal, or if your employees' political donations are more liberal. In contrast, who your CEO donates to politically or who your board of directors donates to politically is not as strong a predictor of whether you take a liberal versus a conservative stance. So to conclude,
Jacob, on that last table, I think it'd be helpful to try and get a proxy for the large investors in these firms. So if you can get like blockholder data, like if BlackRock owns your firm and they're kind of pro-social,
And people have tried to construct some kind of investor ideology measures. I have some in mind, some research by folks at University of Florida and elsewhere. So I could bring in some, 13F filing data connected with those investor ideologies to make those predictions. I think that's a good idea. Thanks, Marcus. So to conclude, we all wanted to analyze these consumer responses to these firms' social stances. And we had 3 questions that we laid out. Let's answer them. So how do consumers respond to these firms' social stances? Well, consumers, especially donors, but not just political donors, seem to be willing to go out and vote with their wallet in meaningful ways around these salient political stances, socio-political stances. Consumers buy more. There's an aligned boycott effect when firms take a stance that you agree with. There's an opposed boycott effect when firms take a stance that you disagree with. The magnitudes here were pretty large, and we quantified the trade-off between the aligned, positive aligned, and negative opposed consumer response. Do these firms' social stances typically maximize revenues? We find positive impacts on average. They're more positive if you take a stance that's better aligned with your consumer base, and they can definitely turn negative if you take a stance that's poorly aligned with your existing consumer base. And why do firms take these social stances? Well, to kind of first order, they seem consistent with what a firm that wanted to maximize its profits would want to do, kind of consistent with the traditional kind of corporate branding view of what firms are doing here, and less consistent with this being some kind of agency problem in the firm. We do estimate a smaller share of stances that seem to hurt revenues, that seem to be particularly correlated with the preferences of your employees and what your owner wants if you're a privately owned company. So there's the potential there that could be some wedge between what's profit maximizing and what firms actually do, but we're still kind of working on fleshing out the details of that. So with that, thank you so much. I'll wrap up my talk, and I'm happy to open up for more questions.